All right, thank you, Joan. And thank you all for coming out tonight. It's kind of a blustery spring night, so I really appreciate everybody filling these seats. So first, I'll tell you how I got to where I am today. I work for the State Division of Marine Fisheries. I've been there for about 30 years. Before that, I grew up in Harwich on the Cape, across the street from a herring run. So I spent a lot of time in the herring run, playing around with eels and herring. And then I got a bachelor's degree at the University of Massachusetts in fisheries biology, a master's degree at the University of Rhode Island on fisheries management, and then worked 5 years with the National Marine Fisheries Service in various places. And I've been with the state ever since at 3 different laboratories in Salem, Gloucester, and now I'm stationed in New Bedford. So the last 10 years I've been able to focus on diatomous fish. These are the fish that come up our rivers every spring to fulfill their life history, so it's a nice focus. And I'm going to talk about eels in that context. I've called this the natural history of American eel, but really what I'm going to do is cover their biology, fisheries, and present management, and then talk about some restoration projects really close to here in Falmouth that may benefit eels. And that's how I'll approach things. It's an hour, so you don't want to listen to me talk for an hour, so if you have questions, please go ahead and ask. So when we say diatomous fish, that means fish that switch habitats to fulfill their life history. And they switch between marine waters and freshwater. And these are the common diatomous fish we have in Massachusetts. And American eel is the only catatomous fish, which means they were born in the ocean and they travel up the freshwater to fulfill their life history. All the others are anatomous, meaning they're born in freshwater and they go back out the ocean to mature. So eel is unique in that way. It's the only catatomous fish among these. But you'll recognize the river herring, smelt, striped bass. These fish have to come up our rivers. And so the state has a dedicated effort to make sure they have open passageways, they have suitable habitat, because they can't do it on their own. If these rivers are blocked, they just can't get up. So there's a real coordinated effort with towns and the state and local government to try to make sure we can provide these fish with a place they need to go. So I like to think of eel as unique. We all think about the fish we like or the birds or the wildlife is unique, and all these creatures are unique. Eel is unique in my mind because it has these features that are unlike most fish in North America. They're the only catatomous fish in North America. There's no other that does that. Born in the ocean, runs up to fresh water. They're panmictic, which means they're a single genetic stock throughout their range. Usually when you have a big geographic range, you have multiple genetic stocks. It's the same genetic stock throughout the range, and I'll come back to that. Semoparous is a big word that just means they spawn and die. They live their whole life up to 20 years and they go out and spawn once and they die. So kind of an epic life history. You know, I wouldn't want to go that way, but that's what they do. They have a real high age maturity among fish, 8 to 15 years. In fact, a lot of females take 20 years to become mature. They're very fecund, which means they hold a lot of eggs, 3 to 10 million eggs. They have one chance to spawn. So the females become large and they hold lots of eggs for their travel out to the Sargasso Sea. And again, the geographic range is huge, from Greenland down to Brazil, the same genetic stock. They occupy more types of habitats than any fish I'm aware of, so they're a generalist, and they're found in all different types of habitats. So really, you'd consider them a very successful fish. And also, some people say, well, are they amphibious? Well, they're not really amphibious, but you can see they climb pretty well. You can see them going up this wall here. When they first come in from the ocean, they're very small, and they're able to climb up vertical surfaces if they're rough and wet. So not really amphibious, but they do strange things. 2 years ago in Kingston, I was going to a site and I came across this eel in the middle of the road. And it was raining that day, but it was going up the hill, not down the hill, away from the river. So I have no idea what this eel was doing, but they're pretty capable of leaving the water. So they almost are amphibious.
So what did you do?
I picked him up and put him back in the river. And it probably climbed right out again and went back up the hill. There was a Cumberland Farms at the top of the hill, so I figured it was going to Cumberland Farms. They're also unique and they have environmental sex determination. Most fish don't have that. They're born with a certain sex. Eels don't develop their sex until about 8 to 10 inches, which is like a 2-year-old eel. So they arrive with no sex declared. A lot of reptiles, not a lot, but some reptiles have this, and it's based on temperature. Temperature will drive snakes to become a certain sex. What they think happens with eels, it's density dependent. So if you have a watershed with a dam that's low in the watershed and it doesn't allow them to move up, they all bunch up and they become mostly males. And the idea is males want to become mature as fast as they can so they can get out, spawn, and die. So they're okay being small, so they leave when they're small. Females want to become large so they can hold lots of eggs. So if you have a watershed that's wide open, lots of space, you tend to produce more females. And how this all works out when they all mix out in the ocean is just amazing, but that's what happens. So you might have heard the different types of eels, but they're all American eel. But here's the different terminologies. Glass eel is what comes in right now from the Sargasso Sea. They come in from the ocean and they have no pigment. They're glassy. And as they stay in our freshwater rivers, they gain pigment and become dark. After about a year, they call them elvers, and they've gained like a brownish yellow pigment, and they look just like an adult eel, but they're just still very small. In Maine and Canada, they'll often call glass eels elvers, so there is some confusion there, but I think elvers is really that first year, that 1 year old. Yellow eels are the common eels that we see most of the time. They're yellowish, they're brownish, and they're immature, and they're living in freshwater habitats or estuaries until they become mature. When they become mature, very quickly, they become silver eels, and they become dark on the top or silvery, white on the bottom. Their eye becomes really large, and what they want to do is to be camouflaged as they head out of the rivers into the ocean, and they want to make this migration out to the Sargasso Sea 1,000, 2,000 miles away, depending on where they are. So it's an incredible transformation. Silver eels are not that common. You don't see them very often because they're very stealthy. A little more on yellow eels. They're really present in every freshwater drainage you can imagine in Massachusetts. They're very often the top fish biomass in freshwater rivers because they stay a long time, they get to be large, and they become the top biomass. And they're also the eel that's targeted for fisheries in Massachusetts for food and for bait. Silver eels, they do fish for them in Canada with weirs, where they trap them as they head out to the ocean. It's not allowed in Massachusetts. It's really been gone for a long time. And again, they're very stealthy. I've only seen a couple silver eels my whole career. Here's one that I caught in Braintree. It was about 1 meter long. And what happens, they don't transform until they're about less than a month away from leaving. So they're yellow eels, and then all of a sudden they transform, and then they get ready to head out. When they leave, they trigger, this is triggered based on the moon phase. They want to leave at a noon moon because there's not a lot of light. They want to leave during a storm event because it elevates the flow in the rivers and the turbidity of the water, and often dropping temperature prompts them to leave. So it really all happens in October. During a storm in October in Massachusetts, all these eels leave at once. A little more on their reproductive biology. They're sexually dimorphic, which means they're different sizes. Males are just little tiny things. They all leave by 16 inches. Females don't leave until they're 18, and they can be 3 feet. They can even be 40 inches long. And so again, males want to travel out to the Sargasso Sea as soon as they're able, and they all, if they're coming from South America or up in Canadian provinces, they all go to the same general area, and they assume there's random mating from all the places where they came from, which again, there's no fish that does this. It's really quite remarkable. So we call the glass eel the young of year American eel, and it hatches in the Sargasso Sea, and then it starts to move westward back to the continent. But it takes 8 to 12 months to do this. So young of the year eels might be out for 8 to 16 months before they reach where they want to go. So we call them young of the year, but they're really often age ones when they arrive. And they're arriving right now on our coastline. I don't think I mentioned this, but leptocephali are what they're called, and that means wavy leaf. And that's what they look like soon after they're born. They take on a body form that's kind of elongated and it's very thin, and they cue to the ocean currents to move westward. They also have magnetite in their skull, and they detect the Earth's magnetic fields, and that tells them they need to go westward in a very broad course. And then the currents deliver them almost randomly to where they end up. This is hard for me to imagine, is that their destinations are completely random, and there's no link to where their parents came from. So it's the opposite of like a salmon, where they home back to where their parents came from. So it's just hard for me to imagine. This photo is a good shot showing the glass eels, and that's an age 1. So the age 1 eel has taken on the body form of a miniature adult, much more thicker and darker. The glass eels just keep gaining pigment their first year once they're in the river, so they can hide until they're black. And then they turn slowly yellowish brown to blend in as they move up the estuary to try to get to further distances in the watershed. So I mentioned panmixia earlier, and again, that means a single genetic stock. And it's kind of a paradox because there's been a lot of studies on them, and they found no difference throughout their range, the same genetic stock. Yet you see differences among the regions. Phenotypes means their expression of size or behavior. And so you see eels down south that mature faster, they grow faster. Up north, they get to be much larger. They're mostly females. So there's differences that you expect to be genetic differences, but they're not finding it. So are they really panmictic? The geneticists will say yes, but I think there's probably something going on where the environment shapes what they become. And there may also be some genetic variation that's yet to be discovered because of our techniques are not as detailed. But there's more to the story than they're just simply a single genetic stock. And this is something I think for future eel biologists, because right now we haven't figured it out, but I think there's more to the story on that. So let me shift to eel fisheries. And I flew through the biology fairly quickly. Any questions on the biology?
Is it true the European eels go to the same spot to spawn?
European eels, different, same genus, different species, go to the Sargasso Sea also. And their young know to head east. So different species, but closely related. The Japanese eel also goes to the middle of the ocean, the Pacific, to this central location. And the same thing, their young go back with random dispersal. And the general theory, and I have no idea if this is true or not, is that when the continents were closer together, there was a single eel species, and they all went to one place in the ocean. And as the continents drifted, they began to separate. I don't even know if that is possible, but that's what some people think. But they have the same general life history, these major eel species in the different continents. They go to the middle of the ocean, spawn, die, and the young then disperse somewhat randomly back to the continents.
Silver eels, when they leave the rivers to go to the Sargasso, do they travel along the bottom?
Very good question. There's been some recent tagging with satellite tags to try to answer that. And they find that they go not to the bottom, but they go great depths. They also found that they were pursued and captured by poor beagle sharks as in northern latitudes. And you can imagine a lot of predators probably see these eels. They leave together, and the thought is they go as a group, and it must be just a tremendous source of food for different types of predators that are out there. But they go down deep, but not to the bottom, about a couple hundred meters.
I'm very ignorant about this. What's their source of food?
What's the source of food for eels? They're generalists, so they eat everything, but they like insects, fish. As they get older, they become one of the top predators. They eat mainly fish, but crayfish. They've been known to eat lots of things. In Australia, they have a giant eel, very different species, that will grab mammals, birds, and it can be 6 feet long. But I think our eel probably is a generalist that feeds on crustacean, insects, and fish.
Their migration to the Sargasso, do they eat on the way, or?
They don't. And no one knows because they've never observed the spawning. But what they've done, they've captured some on the way, and they waste away. They have found that when they're close to spawning, they're just like a tube of eggs. They just sacrifice all their body tissues to make it. They spawn, and absolutely, that's it. So it's really an incredible, devoted life history to pass on your genes.
And the eggs are pelagic?
The eggs are pelagic, and they spawn. They think they spawn in the upper water column, but they really don't know. They've had many research cruises to try to identify, to try to document it, and the best they've done is they've captured the leptocephali in a concentration around the Sargasso Sea, so they know that it emanates from that area. That's the best. I guess I'll take 2 more, then I better get back.
I'm sorry. So if the ocean is warming, has anyone studied the effect on the eels here?
There are people getting PhDs right now on that very question. Really smart people looking at that. And they're looking at, and what they're finding is the metabolism of these little eels picks up. And so it's changing the way they swim, and it's drawing concerns over their energy reserves. Can they make it back? You'll see later, it's changing their migration rates. So climate is really important. Eel populations are not doing great worldwide, and there's a lot of people wondering if climate is one of the reasons.
When do they start to get slimy?
Oh,
Why, is it all defense, or is it?
they're pretty slippery all along. They, that's kind of something they have from the beginning. So They carry it with them, and they don't really generate extra slime like, say, well, like a hagfish or a lamprey might, but they're pretty slimy overall.
Do all eels have an electric self-defense?
No, very few. Our eels do not. There's just a few species that have that.
And do the ones that do they maintain that self-defense even when they're spawning?
Good question. I know nothing about that eel species, so I wonder. If I had that, I'd want to maintain that superpower at all times.
That slime layer, would that be like an antibacterial?
That and probably also, to make it harder for predators to get a hold of them. All right, I'm going to move on to fisheries, but we can come back to biology anytime. I just wanted to kind of go section by section. So eels were really important years ago. It was a fish that was found in every single coastal river embayment, and people went out and caught them. The Native Americans cherished eels. They called it traveling food because they would smoke them and save them for the winter. And they taught colonialists how to fish for them with spears, traps they made out of willow branches, and in-stream stone weirs. And so when people came here, it was one of those species that was available, and people learned to love eel around here. It's really amazing. We've gotten away from a preference for eating eel. Cape Cod eel were very important. The first law that I found in Massachusetts for eel was Orleans in 1797, and then 9 of the 10 first laws that I've seen for eels in Massachusetts were on Cape Cod. So Cape Cod was always a place where people were just trying to survive and just foraging and looking for food from the land, and eels were readily captured most months of the year. There's a reference by Good from 1884, and he's got several specific references on 1879, and he reports the commercial catch in Massachusetts was 400,000 pounds, just commercial, and presently it is about 2,000 or 3,000 pounds, so we've come a long ways from there, and that's just what was reported. In the Bass River, he found that there were 20 fishermen that caught 20,000 pounds in that year. We haven't had 20,000 pounds landed statewide in a long time. And then for this region, he had a specific reference of a winter fishery that employed 100 men that year caught 300 barrels of eels that they shipped to New York markets. So that's right out here. 100 men made money catching eels in 1879. They would set these pots that they made out of willow branches, or they would spear them in the winter through the ice. So it's really a pastime that's faded just dramatically, and it's unfortunate. Here's a graph. It's a little, complex, but what it shows is commercial harvest from 1880 to 2010. This was used in the stock assessment by Atlantic States Marine Fisheries Commission when they tried to assess the population. And what you can see, it's years and then landings in metric tons. And so 2,000 metric tons, U.S. coast, East Coast catch way back here, like 1885. Then it declined. There was probably some overfishing occurring. And then we've got these fluctuations that probably was poor reporting. And then this was the Depression. In the Depression, you'll see spikes with river herring, with eels, with things like this, because people were hungry and they went outside and they caught a lot of eels to eat. And then the numbers fluctuated. And then here, what that bump is, the Japanese market is really large and important. They love their eels. They overfished their Japanese eel. Then they went to Europe and overfished the European eel, or the market depleted the European eel. And they started offering a high price to fishermen in Massachusetts, or really the whole East Coast. They might have been getting 10 cents a pound here, maybe 50 cents a pound. All of a sudden it was $2 a pound, and the effort really increased, and they caught a lot of eels, almost like the historical amount. Then the numbers declined without that market really softening, and it just kept declining. And so it's not a population record, but it's more a harvest record, but I think it reflects that there was some severe overharvesting in the 1970s. That would be my guess. So this graph shows Massachusetts commercial landings, but our records only go back to 1950. And so when I say 20,000 pounds was a lot for 20 fishermen in one river, that was the catch in the 70s until that market. Right about now, right about here was 50 cents a pound. And then boom, went up to $2 a pound. And then it peaked at 500,000 pounds in 1 year. And then I think the numbers just came tumbling down after that. There were no regulatory changes. There was really no change to the market. All of a sudden, eels were not present. And then it declined here around 1993 again, and there was no regulatory changes. It just, the eels were not abundant, and we've been at this flat level ever since. We still sell commercial fishing permits for eels. I'm not sure if we should, but there's not a lot of catch. It's usually 2,000 or 3,000 pounds now is caught, and mostly goes to striped bass bait, where years ago people ate the eels that they caught.
When I first moved to the Cape, there was a lot of mackerel. That dropped off also similar like that?
Yeah, different dynamic, because there's a lot of mackerel offshore, but it's mackerel like it to be cold, and so you won't see them close to shore unless it's cold. But a different dynamic. I guess my point is I feel like this European market, Japanese market that really brought that high price led to drastic overfishing, and this bump was seen throughout the East Coast, and I think it's really driving where we are today by having these low populations still. So presently we still have eels everywhere. Every freshwater drainage you can imagine has got some eels going up it, but our commercial landings are at the lowest level on record presently, and they've been that way for almost 20 years. So that's a concern. The concern is spread throughout North America. The Canadian U.S. fisheries peaked about at 4 million pounds in the late 1970s, and they've dropped down to about 1 million pounds now, mainly because Canada still has some decent fisheries. And there's now growing concerns about the status of eel in North America. And so now let me move on a little bit to eel management. This is probably the boring part, but I felt like I should cover this. There's a long history of towns managing eels and then working with the state in the last 75 years to manage eels. And then recently, interstate management has kicked in under the Atlantic States Marine Fisheries Commission. And that's an interstate group that manages migratory fish. And then the Endangered Species Act got into play because some people petitioned to see if eels should have been listed as an endangered species. And so there were 2 petitions that looked at this. To be an endangered species, you have to be threatened by extinction to some part of your range or all your range. So it's a pretty high threshold to be listed as an endangered species. And so the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service was petitioned twice, 2007, 2015. And in both cases, their review said it was not warranted to list eel as either endangered or threatened. They weren't at risk of extinction. They expressed great concerns for their welfare. They were historically depleted to lowest levels on records, but it didn't trip that threshold of being an endangered species. So a lot of concern to go along with this process, but not quite at that level. So let me touch on Massachusetts eel management. We have commercial harvest. We allow a catch of 9 inches or higher. Same minimum size for recreational. We allow 25 eels per person per day recreationally. You have to get a permit if you want to commercially harvest. And we only allow with pots or spearing. We don't allow the nets in the rivers anymore. And we also have a closure in the spring for fine mesh nets to discourage the taking of glass eels. You can harvest glass eels in Maine. They were grandfathered to do this years ago, and they still do it. In recent years, the price of glass eels has skyrocketed because now the Asian markets are buying eels from Maine and shipping them live over to culture facilities. And so we have a ban on that type of gear because people are now coming around from Maine to try to get these glass eels because they're so valuable. This statute also allows us to transfer state control to towns. And most Cape towns have accepted that management authority. Most Cape towns manage eels. Off the Cape, it just goes back to the state because they haven't asked to manage eels. So we have that ability to work with towns. And if you get above the first dam, the authority goes to the Division of Fish and Wildlife, a sister agency to my agency, the Marine Fisheries. So there's dual management, but a lot of the management occurs in the tidal area or just up to the first dam. That's where most of the eel potting occurs. So we're pretty active managing that commercial harvest. So a little bit about the Atlantic States Marine Fisheries Commission. They are all these states joined together to manage all kinds of species that migrate across state boundaries, and the idea is to try to conserve those species as a common management process. They fairly new. They had a coastwide American eel plan in the year 2000. They did a benchmark stock assessment in 2012, and then an update occurred in 2017. I was on that stock assessment team, and this resulted in amendments to the management plan soon after that. So the stock assessment declared eel to be depleted, it was really what's called a data poor species. We had very poor indices on how they were doing. We had no indices on silver eels, none. We have no yellow eel indices for New England, and we have a scattering of glass eel indices and some yellow eel indices, mostly in the mid-Atlantic. But what we concluded was there were multiple sources of mortality that were occurring, and we did identify that overharvest in the 70s, habitat changes, passage mortality. Eels have to go through hydroplants in big rivers, and those turbines are not friendly to eels. Disease and parasites, and then back to climate, potentially shifting oceanographic conditions that might be less favorable to get the eels back to the coast. So with all these things, we recommended that a reduction in mortality is needed, and that set in motion a management process to look at how to reduce mortality. And also, just quickly, without going over, 2017, we updated the assessment, and we had really no difference found in the indices, although there was probably a third of the indices that were neutral or stable 5 years prior were now declining significantly. So still the same status as depleted, but a little more evidence of declining populations. So here's a graph just to show you some of the indices. And so it's an index of abundance that is produced from a model that models some what's called fishery independent data source that's collected by scientists. And then you model flow, temperature to try to tune it and standardize it. And you come out with the standardized indices. And then you combine those indices into coastwide indices. And so here's a 20-year index. And you can see it's a flat trend with a lot of variability. Here's the 40-year index, and it's showing a little bit of that decline from the 70s. And then it's fairly flat. So you just don't have any indices that go back further than 1974. So we need better data. We need longer term series. We need to have information that goes further back. But it's just not that long ago that people started collecting good quality data on the population sizes. The data I showed you earlier was commercial catch data. So it's a proxy for the population, but it's really just total catch and doesn't directly show how the population might be doing.
There's no really collapse in the population, like 100 times or 10 times. It's only like 2 times less.
Well,
4 times.
if you look at the commercial records, I wouldn't call it a collapse. I would say that it's declined to its historic low levels, and the stock assessment, there's a series of terms they come out with, and we determine it to be depleted, which is different from over-harvested. So depleted is kind of a middle of the assessment. So would not call it a collapse, didn't qualify for Endangered Species Act, but still pretty sharp decline from the 70s to where we are today.
It's probably not worth for the fishermen to hunt for it.
It's what?
It's probably not worth the effort for the fishermen to...
In many cases, it's not. Yeah. These indices here are fishery independent, which means they're collected by monitoring programs that don't involve fishing efforts. So they're considered to be generally better quality than fishery dependent indices. But it made a very good point that fishermen are not pursuing eels as much as they used to. So a management plan came out in 2014, and what, based on the recommendation to reduce mortality, a commercial catch cap was set for the East Coast based on recent landings data. So it was like a catch quota. There was none before that, so that was set for all East Coast states to have a certain target, what they should catch and not overharvest. And it wasn't easy setting that, but it was done. For glass eels, it was set for Maine and South Carolina, the 2 states that are allowed to take glass eels. So they now have a glass eel quota. So those things kicked in after that assessment. They also made provisions to allow development of new glass eel fisheries. Before it was just banned, where you had to be grandfathered, such as Maine or South Carolina, or you couldn't have one. A process was set up where they had to have really extensive monitoring if somebody wanted to open up a glass eel fishery. Also allowed a harvest for research and aquaculture. And so far, only North Carolina has asked to have an aquaculture permit, and they were allowed to have 200 pounds to grow out and to try to find out if they could, make money selling eels in that type of a setting. So I actually support this. I think it's a good idea if we could learn to grow eels ourselves. And so it was very contentious. It wasn't supported by everybody. This, I think, is a concern because you know, you have to, the eels are worth so much money now as glass eels, you have to have a way to contain that catch. Make sure there's compliance to your quotas, otherwise you could have a problem.
And so what are they doing with the glass eels in Asia? Are they eating them, or are they using them, what are they using them for?
They raise them up, and most of the market is in Japan, where they're highly valued. Countries like China, South Korea, Taiwan, Hong Kong, a number of countries receive the glass eels live, and they grow them up in culture settings, and then they sell the product to Japan. And that happens in other countries too. I mean, there's other eels that are sold the same way, but the Japanese market is so large, it's so important that they have a tremendous demand, and that's what happens. So I guess my point here was, I think starting quota-based management was a good thing to come out of this. It's always hard to do because people don't like to divide up the pie, but it happened, and so we're starting to learn more about conserving these fisheries. I want to talk a little bit about the young of year surveys, because we manage a couple of those in Massachusetts. These stars show the locations where people collect these glass eels when they come in, and you can see there's stations in every state except for North Carolina. Here's our station, our primary station, the Jones River Glass Eel Index in Kingston. It's this little trap here. And you think, oh my God, what is that going to catch? Because it's such a small proportion of the channel. They actually come up along here, and they like to go into that box, and we catch quite large numbers at times. So here's the data that it produces. This is the geometric mean of the catch every year from 2001 forward, and it is a significant declining trend. And then for the stock assessment, you take those numbers and you put it into a model that's tuned for temperature and flow, and it's what's called a generalized linear model, and it standardizes the index so it can be compared to all of the stations on the East Coast. And so the modeled index shows a similar decline, perhaps even sharper, but it's a modest declining trend at this site, but it is a significant trend. And also we learn about how they interact with the environment. This graph shows the average winter temperature on the x-axis, and then this shows a Julian date, and with the Julian date, 1 is January 1st, and so it shows the date at which they begin to come into the rivers or caught by our trap, and it makes sense. As temperature's warming, they come in earlier. So lower here means an earlier date. So we have a significant relationship. They're coming in early when the ocean's warmer. That makes sense. So then you ask, okay, well, what's happened lately? And so this graph shows the years in the x-axis. Here's the Julian date again. And so we started 17 years ago, and this is now a significant trend declining. So they're coming in earlier in just a 17-year window. So you asked the question about climate. Well, here's a little bit of evidence that just the warming we've seen in the last 17 years is causing a trend of the eels coming in earlier. So they're migrating faster in the ocean. Their metabolism might be, a little bit more advanced, and they're coming in. I don't know if that's good or bad. I don't know if they're ready to feed when they arrive, because here's the thing, the river temperature is not that important on their arrival. It's really correlated to the ocean temperature, because that drives their 1,000, 2,000 mile journey. And so they're moving along. If it's warmer, they're moving faster. When they come into the river could be really cold, but they're here. And do they have food? I mean, are they in a condition to feed? I'm not sure if it's good or bad.
Has anyone tried to make a measurement against how rapid the magnetic field is changing?
Oh, that's a good question. I think there are people that look at that, and I can't even begin to guess whether it's happening rapidly and whether the natural selection of these animals could keep up with that.
I'm just curious, because I've heard sometimes people are saying the field is changing fairly rapidly or something.
It changes naturally over a very long period of time. I don't know if it changes, quick enough that these fish would adapt to or not. Many ocean fish, many ocean creatures use the Earth's magnetic field to set their course for large migrations. So I would imagine they can handle, very slow changes, but I don't really know much else about that.
Question?
Excellent questions.
So we've seen a decline along the eastern coast of North America.
Mm-hmm.
What is happening in South America?
South America, I've described this to be data poor for North America. South America is almost data absence. There is like no information. All that we really know, we tried to get information from Central America, Caribbean, South America, and all we really found out was that dealers were just beginning to go there to buy glass eels, and there were no regulations. So it was really a question of can they set up the political process to get access to buy eels. But no data, no indices, no real metrics on population size. So I think in general, if you go further into like north to like New Brunswick, Nova Scotia, some of those outer Canadian provinces have probably better populations. Quebec is not doing well, but some of those more pristine areas, the eels are doing better. I can't even guess what's happening in the southern end of their range. For other diadromous fish, what you're seeing is the southern end of their range is moving northward. And that's happened in the last 50 to 75 years. If you think about Atlantic salmon, rainbow smelt. So some of those species, their southern end is just moving up fairly rapidly. With eel, we don't even know enough to say.
I was wondering, along that same line, given that eels have such a unique history, are essentially one large stock around the globe, how effective can management be that the United States is doing when these eels are going to go through Sargasso Sea, and who knows where they're going to end up, whether progeny is going to end up, other countries aren't participating in it.
Right. It's an excellent question, and we've been challenged by that at the Atlantic States Marine Fisheries Commission level, and Canada's quick to tell us, you're just part of the range. You're trying to set things, but you're just part of the range. There was a big meeting in Quebec in 2014 to talk about, how do we get together? And there was discussion with the Gulf states, because they're American eels in the Gulf of Mexico. And so I think the Gulf states and the Canadian provinces have been having discussions with the U.S. But here's the thing, that gets into international treaty business, which is really hard to do. They did that for Atlantic salmon, Atlantic halibut, a few other species, but that's where eel has to go. I'm talking a lot about, this is a status of eel. It's really a status of eel as we know it as they enter our rivers. So that's only part of the picture. So here's a fun set of graphs, and I got to confess, I've cherry-picked a really cool set of data to show me this. The Saugus River from 2008. We see lots of pulses in eels as they come into our rivers. So catch per effort is number of eels per hour, and so pretty big catches of eels. Glass eels come in, here's the date, and you can see four distinct peaks in the Saugus River on the North Shore. So you might say is the temperature, so you overlay water temperature, and you can see, some ramping up of this first catch here with the temperature coming up, and then it dips, and then it comes up again. So you say, okay, maybe it is temperature. But then if you put in moon phase, it shows the picture even better. So with your moon phase, you get your highest tidal amplitudes, and so they use that amplitude to push them in the coastal river and drive them up the rivers. And so again, not all the data sets look this good. In this river, our trap is up the stream about 10 miles. And so there's a lag. A couple days after the full moon, couple days after the new moon is when that peak kicks in. This time it was a little bit before. But they really use that. And every year you see 2 or 3 peaks like this strongly associated with that new or the full moon.
Have you seen that delays or advances in the peak correlate to storms that might be happening?
We really don't see that, and we haven't really looked at the numbers that closely yet. What I have seen is the relation to the peak is often related to river miles from the ocean. So if you're real close to the ocean, the peak has no difference, and if you're up a few miles, there's a lag. But it's something that we hope to look at over time, is to try to figure that out. And remember, the silver eels depend on the moon phase, but they don't care. They do care. They don't want to go on the full moon. They just want to go on the new moon. But the glass eels are using that amplitude, so they just come up with that big tide. And this information is well known to people that come here to poach eels illegally. They know where to go and the time of year. So our law enforcement is really diligent during these moon phases. So here's a summary on the things that affect glass eel migrations. Again, the tidal amplitude is really important. Catch peaks are associated with moon phase. Water temperature, below 10 degrees, they're really not moving. 10 degrees to 12 degrees Celsius, and they start to migrate some. Discharge is important. When the river flows strongly, they slow right down. Water velocity above 25 centimeters per second, they really can't handle that, so they just sit down in the substrate. And then ocean temperatures, we know that warm winters cause an earlier onset to the run, and the date of onset is significantly related to winter ocean temperature, much more so than river temperature, because they spend so much time traveling across the ocean to get here. So really interesting environmental cues on these fish. Okay, here's eel aquaculture. I wanted to touch on this. Really big business worldwide. The Japanese just cherish this eel for holidays, special occasions, smoked eel, grilled eel. They love it. And it's really good. I don't know if people have you had eel? It's really fantastic. And we just, as a culture in the US, have gotten away from it. And it's really a shame because it's really tasty. But Japanese love it. They've over-harvested their eel. So what happened around 2012, there was a tsunami that affected a lot of the Japanese eel culture facilities. And so other Asian countries started to compete for those glass eels. China, Taiwan, Korea, and they started buying the eels to sell to Japan. And when they did, they started offering higher prices. And so we started to have a real increase both in American eel harvest for glass eels and also poaching, because the Maine was really the only place they were catching them. So,
sorry, just one quick question. So, can they not breed eel in aquaculture? Is that what they do with the glass eels?
right, they haven't, the Japanese are spending millions to try to figure out how to breed them in captivity. And they've been doing it for ages, and I have no idea where they are. I know that there's some scientists that have successfully spawned females in captivity, and they're having trouble with keeping the young alive. So the people that crack that code are going to make a lot of money. And so that's what everyone wants to do. So for now, they ship them, they fly them over live, and they raise them up for about 1.5 years to hit a market size of about 12 to 8 inches. And then they sell them mainly to Japan. These countries love eels too, but they're looking for the best price they can get. And you can see it's a very high density culture setting where they've just got thousands of eels in individual tanks. So here's the main glass eel fishery. And again, it's grandfathered. They did it years ago when price was low. And this is just a snapshot of 2007 to 2012. The y-axis is in millions of dollars. So the whole glass eel fishery was just worth like less than $1 million. And then here's when those other Asian countries started to kind of get in on the Japanese market. And the Japanese have been offering $250, $300 a pound for a long time. And all of a sudden, the availability was low for their eels. So they came here, there was competition. All of a sudden, 2012, the price shot up to $2,000 a pound, $2,500 a pound. And then you had value in the eel fishery in Maine of $40 million, over $40 million in 1 year. That was the year we had just tremendous illegal poaching activity of people coming down here. Every river I went to had some illegal gear in the water. And this is what you would see back then. You would see fyke nets set just in places where you might not see them, but they were, I would see them in my travels. This has changed. You don't see the fyke nets anymore. The fishermen tend to be stealthy. They're coming at night. They're dip netting, and it's harder to catch them. But one thing we did do for many years, we had a fine at $100 per episode. We increased that fine to $10,000 per episode. So we have the ability to confiscate gear and fine them pretty significantly. So it hasn't stopped. There's been 2 cases of poaching this week. 2 days ago, we had 2 sites that had poachers that were under surveillance. So, it's still happening, but we're not seeing the nets as much as we used to. So this is a big concern because we spend so much time trying to restore eels, and, to lose all that recruitment that would be our future stock, it's a big concern in Massachusetts.
So they're transported in water by air?
Yep.
Isn't that a place to catch them?
Well, they try. But what happens is if they can get them to Maine, primarily Maine or South Carolina, and get a legitimate buyer to, document them, and then get them to New York or Boston airport with the right papers, they can go. So there's a lot of law enforcement that's trying to, you know, jump those routes, and they've had some successful cases, but there's also very high incentives given that price. The price exceeded $3,000 a pound this year for the first time. So that's over $1 per eel. So there's no seafood in America that has that kind of value.
If someone were to spot a net in a parking lot, you just call the local police and say, hey, there might be a poaching operation here?
Local police or the environmental police, Massachusetts Environmental Police, have a Hingham radio room, which you can find online. They've asked to, you know, contact the radio room in Hingham or your local police.
Okay.
And that's the best way to do it. And you know, you don't see them as much, but please be diligent. You might see some activity, and it's not helping all our efforts to have this illegal harvest.
Of course not.
Do all those herring volunteers out there know about it?
It's, yeah, I think it was really big 2012, 13, and then it slowed down a little bit because the new fine. But I think with the price this year, it's just, you know, the incentives are too big. You know, the potential's there to make a lot of money. So, you know, I think they need to, if they can catch them transporting across state boundaries, it can be a felony, and there can be some severe penalties in that regard. So I think that's what they're trying to do. They're trying to catch them as they cross boundaries. Okay, so I'm going to move from the management into Eel Passage. How are we doing for time?
Okay.
Oh, there we go. All right.
Yeah, but I mean, we advertise it in around 8, so you're.
Okay, then we're doing fine. So, yeah, and we can come back to questions anytime. But what I want to point out is that for many years we've been working on fish passage, and we've been focused on river herring. And so we build fish ladders. Recently we've been looking at dam removal as an option to allow river herring to pass. But we didn't think about eels until very recently. And I think the feeling was, well, eels can climb, so they can just get over anything. But the truth is, there's things that they can't deal with. If a culvert's perched, they can't get in there at all. If there's a narrow fishway with a high velocity, they can't go through that. They can climb this really well. If it's a metal flume with a straight metal wall, they can't go up metal. It's just too smooth of a surface. So there's a lot of places where we thought eels could do well, but the truth is they can't. Here's a few more shots. And so here's a dam at which eels would go over so easily. They'd just get right up over that. A real craggy dam like this, they would get over pretty well. They can't negotiate. This is called an Alaskan steep pass ladder. When this is flowing, they can't go through that. You know, small eels. And here's a dam where eels actually get over it, but it's a big struggle. They can do it, but it's a lot of work. So in the last few years, we've been looking at passage in terms of, okay, if we can't take a dam out, what can we do that will help both river herring and eels and other species? So we've been looking at passageways. So once again, consider they can climb rough surfaces, but they don't swim very well against high velocities. This photo here is Cedar Lake on the over to the west here in Falmouth, and this ladder was rebuilt in 2014, and we thought we were doing great things by having a new ladder, but the notches we narrowed, and all of a sudden they can't pass through that notch. And so we went from these wide notches that we wanted to improve to focus flow for herring, and all of a sudden the eels kind of gave us a lesson in science and biology. These eels were trying to get up this way, and when the top is wet, they can get over. So we've learned a lot, and we started to look at, you know, whenever approaching a site, we're thinking about more than just river herring and thinking about other species. So we've been installing eel passageways when we think they're absolutely necessary. We've done about one a year since 2007. And also positive is there's more dam removals in the last 10 to 15 years, where it's 20 years ago, it was just not a common strategy at all. So I think that collectively, eel passage is improving. And here's some shots of some of the eel ways that we've constructed. We have a fishway crew, we have a shop. My shop foreman, Ed Clark, is really good at fabricating materials, and so he custom builds these things. Sometimes they're gravity fed through tubes that attract eels up a ramp, and sometimes there's a pump, and this is a solar supply pump ramp. And then here's another solar supply pump ramp down in Harwich. And so there's a little boat bilge pump in here that has flow that goes down the ramp to attract them, and then flow that goes in the tank to keep them alive until volunteers can come let them go. So I'm going to run through some of these examples for you. Here's a list of the ones we've done, and there's 2 others that I didn't put up there because I kind of ran out of space to stuff it in there, but these are the main ones we've done. And if we sort them by type, the type in red, those have AC power, 110 volt that supplies a bilge pump. The next 2 in blue are solar powered that supply a bilge pump. And these 3 here are gravity supply, where this, I like these the best because there's not as many working parts. They're taking gravity flow to get eels over an obstruction through a ramp. So these are ones we've put in. I'm going to run through some of the sites. The Saugus River in Linfield was our first one we did. We had a grant from the Gulf of Maine Council. At this site, it's a water supply, the Lynn Water and Sewer Commission, and it's their water supply, so that dam removal wasn't an option. They managed their flows by sending flows through a bottom opening sluice gate. And so we got out there, we made some calculations. The head pressure and the velocity is too high for eels to go through the sluice gate. There's rarely flow over the crest, so we realized that eels couldn't get over here. So it was a good candidate for putting in an eel ramp. You don't want to build an eel ramp unless it's absolutely necessary because it's a lot of work to keep them going. So we put this in. Here's the ramp. It's got a pump here. It sends flow down the ramp and then also keeps the tank watered. And a watershed group up there counts the eels, and they've been doing it now since 2007. With the next stock assessment, the eel data from this is probably going to be accepted as the first yellow eel index of abundance for New England. So I'm kind of excited about that. I recognize it's not the greatest data, but it's going to be an index of population abundance. You need to have 10 years of data before it'll be accepted, and this is going to hit that threshold, or it already has. So here's the tank. This one doesn't catch glass eels because it's up in the watershed quite a ways. So the glass eels don't get up this far until their 2nd year when they're larger. So they're elvers or even bigger. Here are the catch numbers. In red is the catch per hour, and the blue is total catch. So in 11 years, this has moved 93,000 eels. And it's kind of exciting to me because you're probably seeing some of these males that came in back here, 2007, are maturing and leaving. So those eels were really not surviving in that watershed years ago. Now they're getting up into the upper watershed, and some of the males are leaving. So we think this is a site, it's not producing millions of eels, but it's producing recruitment of eels to get out to the Sargasso Sea that'll hopefully help the whole East Coast abundance. So one small example of something that might be helping. Here's Grassy Pond in Harwich. Start off as a solar-powered ramp made out of wood that we built for $200. And in this case, it's a metal flume. When I was a kid, this was a wooden flume, and there was a herring run, and the glass eels, I didn't know back then, but I'm assuming they went up the wood flume quite easily. When it was replaced with a metal flume, it probably stopped the herring run and the glass seal run just immediately. So we're working to try to find ways to get better passage for all species, but for now we're passing eels. And this tank here has caught up to 25,000 eels in a given year and helped them move upstream. Pilgrim Lake in Orleans is a gravity-fed tank, and this tank is really unique. It's the only one I'm aware of anywhere. It floats in the head pond and receives trickle flow down a tube that is detected by eels in the downstream side of the dam. It's not siphon flow, it's not pumped, it's just trickle flow that's maintained by the buoyancy of the tank. And my guy Ed Clark came up with it. When he designed it, I said, that'll never work. And the first day he put it out, the next morning it had eels in the tank. Wow. So, and it's caught more than I think any other we've set out. Here's the obstruction. It's managed by the town with this orifice flow, subsurface orifice. Eels can't deal with that head pressure and velocity. So they try, but they really can't get through there. So we put this in. We're going to rebuild this fall. My crew is going to go out there and rebuild it. And with a new flume, we're going to make it passable to eels and herring. So that eel ramp will go away. But it was a good experimental site. If you don't need an eel ramp, you don't want to make one. But in this case, we learned a lot about it, and I think we fine-tuned that technology for applying elsewhere. Here's a look into the tank. So this is floating at pond level, and there's a matting that receives that trickle flow through a screen. and the eels climb right up that matting and pop out. And we've had just tens of thousands of eels in that tank. And 2 years in a row, it had over 40,000 eels caught, which is really big numbers.
Have you ever looked at municipal water pressure powered pumps?
No?
See, this is a rather, I had a water problem in a basement in Silver Spring, Maryland. And I learned that municipal water powered pumps use water pressure going over like a straw, put your finger on a straw,
Yep.
draws the water up the tube,
Mm-hmm.
and can go up to 8 feet.
Wow.
And then take it along just through the water pressure going over
Uh-huh.
the tube. I don't see why you couldn't draw a pool full of eels up the tube and over.
If they would be attracted to that, or if they would be aggregated to that, what the eels seek out is the lowest flow. They look for the spot in a dam. They're looking for just the trickle flow.
I see.
That situation, they might shy away from that. If they were aggregated, it might suck them right in, and they'd probably be okay. But it is amazing. We size the pump systems with bilge pumps from boats because we only want trickle flow going down the ramp. And it's amazing. They detect the trickle flow. It's almost like they smell the others ahead of them, and they'll all just follow up.
Interesting.
So I'd like a more durable pump. Maybe I could look to water supply industry to see if they have more durable pumps, because the boat bilge pumps fail after a year or two, and we have to replace them. But this is a nice innovation. We built one similar to it a couple of years ago in Rockport, Mass. So there's a second one out there now. And hopefully, when we rebuild the flume, we'll take this one away and it won't be needed anymore at that site. Oh yeah, we also went from a 5-gallon bucket. The first prototype was just a 5-gallon bucket. And then we made a custom aluminum tank that floated. And this is the style that's in Rockport right now. Everything comes down to the buoyancy. If the buoyancy allows flow to trickle down that tube, eels will show up the next day. If the buoyancy isn't correct, it'll ride too high, or if it's too low, a siphon flow is too much pressure. So I think he came up with something that I never expected would work. And now I want to touch on a study that we just completed in Lake Sevasia and Taunton. Here's a case where there were 4 dams in the way for migratory fish. And a group of partners, excellent group of partners, took out the lower 3 dams. The 3rd dam was taken out this past fall. And the 4th dam was a dam that's owned by DCR, Department of Conservation and Recreation. And they reconstructed the dam because it was a very important recreational area, so they couldn't take that dam out. And when they reconstructed, they put in a fish ladder, and they allowed us to design a really long eel ramp here. And so this eel ramp went in. And so what it did was those 3 dam removals and this dam reconstruction allowed eels to get in the lake. So we started tagging them with pit tags, which are kind of like the thing you have in your car that records you passing through tolls. It just picks up the signal that it's you. And so we tag these eels with this little tag. And so we catch them again. We know it's our eel. And by doing a pot study, we can, what's called a mark and recapture study, you can estimate the population size of the eels. So here we are applying the pit tag. Here's our pots. We did it for a few years before the dams came out and then continued a few years afterwards. And here are population numbers. Not many eels were living in this lake. They probably got up anyways because some could climb over all 4 dams, but not many. The first year there was only 75 eels was the estimate for the whole lake. And as the dams came out, the numbers increased, but very slowly. And so we're happy to see that, and we're going to keep doing the study to see, if the numbers will increase. You would think a lake of this size had thousands of eels, but really pretty low numbers and pretty high confidence intervals, meaning that our data we were catching the eels so frequently, recapturing them, that we had very high confidence intervals in our data. Just not that many eels. So our next step is we've put pit tag antennas on the dam. So when our eels go out as silver eels, we can detect that and start to learn about silver eels. Again, there's no indices of silver eels on the East Coast. We're hoping we might develop an index for this site here. And so far we've had 30 eels leave. And then we want to keep continuing to monitor how the eel population does as the last dam was taken out this fall. We also did a tag retention study as part of this. We have big tanks in Sandwich where we caught a bunch of eels and tagged them different ways and see how they survived. And we had really good 94% survival for our tagged eels. So that was good. So we put it all together, and last week, I'm kind of, touting my own horn here, but last week a publication was put out on this. It just came out a few days ago, on the effects of dam removals on yellowfills, American eel abundance in northeastern watersheds. So sometimes it's nice when we can take this information and get a publication out of it like we did here, and at the same time improve fish passage. So we're happy for that. So I'm going to finish up with just some discussion on recent projects in this area in Falmouth. They were done to improve fish passage that might have potential to help out eel benefits as well. I'm going to talk about very briefly the Coonamessett River. There's a lot going on. I think folks here are probably pretty familiar and maybe participating. Our agency has provided some technical assistance, but we're not a very active partner. But a lot of credit goes to these partners, to the dam removals that are occurring in Coonamessett River. They're going to make it easier for eels to get up to the lake. And so this is a really important project that's happening right down the road. These two projects my agency was more deeply involved with. We constructed this fishway in Bourne Pond, which is the upper end of Waquat Bay. It goes into Bog Pond and then further up into Bourne Pond. There was no fish passage there, so we took out a small dam and then built this fish ladder in 2016. And then the town, working with the Natural Resource Conservation Service, reconstructed Cedar Lake in Falmouth in 2014. So these are three local projects that I just wanted to mention. In Cedar Lake, again, we thought we had things really done well, but we didn't realize that these notches were too narrow for eels. And so what we've done since then, working with the town, we put in this siphon flow pipe here that sends flow down a pipe to water the top of these crests, these weirs. And then we tacked some matting, and this photo doesn't show that, but there's some anchor mat, which is like a landscape matting. We put it on the sides of these weirs, and then the hose sprinkles flow, and so they climb up really easily and they pop over. It's not perfect, but it gets them over.
Can you go back one slide to the one?
Whoops. Yep.
Can the eels navigate that one?
Yes, and I'm going to show you
Okay.
evidence. First, here's Bourne Pond. This was a fun project for us because we specialize in rebuilding small ladders, but we have a small crew. And this one was kind of a big job for us. There was a dam that had no fish passage, but a flume. Then there was a dam downstream that was in the way, but there was erosion around it. And so we pulled this dam out and we built, here's our wood form for the concrete fish ladder. And we brought our excavator down here. And that's our little mini excavator. And we constructed this fish ladder. And then we tore this dam out. And it was about all our excavator could handle. It was just pulling those pieces of concrete out. Reestablished the channel. The project was paid for by the town of Falmouth and conducted by my crew with help of the town of Falmouth. And I think we spent $7,000 in the project. It was not that expensive to do those two features.
So the flow going through that flume is not too much for the eels to go up?
It is, but here's what they do. This is last April. And I was there today, but before I came here, and the substrate down here is full of little eels.
Yeah.
So they're staging up. And what happens is the glass eel really can't handle this flow, which is designed for river herring. But a wood board like this, they have no problem climbing up.
Okay, so it wouldn't help to like put burlap over the top of that and have it break down into the water?
In this case, we keep the pools up really high,
Yeah.
so there's splashing occurring.
Right.
And so here we haven't seen a problem. This is a 2x6,
Yeah.
and they don't have a problem getting over. It's not perfect. It's not like with dam removal where there's nothing in the way. But we think, like with Cedar Lake, the top dries out, so we had to do something additional. I think in this case, they pop over, and then the photograph doesn't show it. Let me see if I can go to the previous one.
Do you have any trouble with seagulls?
Seagulls don't really get after them, but grackles get after glass eels. I'm going to go back to this site became a project because we were going around here, and all of a sudden, late May, we would see hundreds of grackles in this channel here when the flow reduced, And what was happening, eels were climbing up this flume when the flow came down. They were waiting for months, and then when the flow came down, they'd come up, and the birds would find them. And there'd be hundreds of birds, and people say, what are the birds doing there? So we started looking at them, and they were picking off every single eel. So that's why this became a project, because of that mortality. You'd rather not have to have this, but this is the water supply for 80 Makepeace, and so for their cranberry bogs. So this is a dam that you're not going to likely remove. So
Why not put like a mesh grate over the area with holes small enough that the birds can't get down into there, but big enough to allow raindrops to fall in?
that could work. In this situation, though, when the flow was strong, they can't get up there. So they were forced to wait to mid-May. Then they all would come up at once when it got dry, and they were picked off. So they'd be waiting, and so now they can pass right now as soon as they arrive. So we feel like there's less mortality. But every site is different. In this site here, this is at Mass Audubon and Wellfleet. They wanted to have a complete cover, and so we've done that. Here's a cover, and in some cases we don't have covers, but we want to reduce poaching potential, so we lock them up, and we want to reduce predation. Everything eats these glass eels, so things get their shot at glass eels at some point. Fish, wildlife, birds, everything loves to eat these glass eels when they come in. So let me go forward, and please, if you have any questions. Whoops, going the wrong way, sorry.
So what's a bigger threat to eel mortality then? Is it the fishing side of it, or is it these man-made structures obstructing their passage?
I would say that the man-made structures, in many cases, eels can get around, and so that holds them up. It probably causes more mortality. I worry more about their habitat changes to their freshwater habitat and habitat changes to their marine environment. I think, eels have found a way, and we had much higher populations of eels back at a time we had much poorer fish passage. So if you think back to the 50s and earlier, our fish passage wasn't very good at all, but the eel populations were much higher. So I think that passage is probably not the culprit. I think it's our changing environment, our landscape development, our human use in coastal areas are making the habitats less suitable. So let's see. Okay, so I'm going to finish up here, and if you have any questions. So have we made progress? I think we are. I think eel is not just this slimy, disgusting animal anymore. I think people are starting to care about eels a little bit. So we're raising awareness. I think the interstate management plans, even though there's a lot to be desired, I think they're starting the process of having a coordinated quota-based management process on the East Coast, and hopefully it'll be coming up with Canada and other locations too. And I think that collectively, towns, locals, everybody is working to now think about eel passage. And that includes dam removals as well as just things they can do to make culverts better and just try to improve their passage. So there is things that I think are really favorable. The things I'm concerned about, I think the populations remain really low, even though that big push in the 70s to catch eels is a long time ago. The population came down, and we're not seeing large improvements. So why is that response slow? It's a concern for me. I'm also concerned about the world markets that have just made a black market for these eels and just made the incentive so high for poaching. They're worth so much that you're seeing a lot of legal activity. Fishermen are going all the way down to the Carolinas to poach eels. So this is a big concern. With all this interest in restoring populations, will that negate a lot of those efforts? And then for locally freshwater habitat concerns, a lot of these ponds on the Cape years ago were not green, they were clear, and they were not as stratified as they are now. Eels are a bottom creature, and they need to use that bottom. If some of the bottom of ponds are just not usable because they're fully stratified and have low dissolved oxygen, then they've lost that potential habitat. I think that's a real problem for them, particularly in the Cape. And that's something that we can address or try to, because we need to look at the way we're using our nutrients. And I think we need to find ways to do better than just single home septic systems if we want to try to address that eutrophication problem. And then the tougher problem to address is climate impact on marine habitat. It's a bigger question. The ocean's warming. what's this going to do to the glass eel migration? You know, they have a pretty small body mass, and they've got to get back to coastal rivers where they can start to feed. It's kind of an uncertainty. We don't know what it really means, and there's not much we can do about it in the near term. So I would focus on these freshwater habitat concerns and try to have folks pay attention to that at the local level and see what we can do to produce improvements in these freshwater habitats.